Okay, I'm going to talk to you about related services and the least restrictive environment. The idea for this presentation came about as I was interviewing a inner city school principal, and she was sharing with me that the service delivery method for related services in her school is to do entirely pull out of the classrooms. They don't do any push in or co-teaching model, and I thought that it would be beneficial to discuss with a group of teachers or present this ongoing to folks as to why we really need to consider the least restrictive environment when we're talking about related services. So, a little bit about me. I'm an occupational therapy assistant by license. I've worked in the disability community for 20 plus years, but I have 6 years of experience as a school based occupational therapy practitioner. I also teach at Owens Community College in the occupational therapy assistant program. So it's important to me to be educating others about the role of occupational therapy and best practices, not only in the school setting, but just for OT services in general. And then I'm pursuing my master's in special education from Bowling Green State University, and I anticipate graduating in the spring of 2020. So our objectives for this presentation is going to be brief. However, we're going to discuss what are related services, what is the least restrictive environment, what does that mean, and then how can we look at related services and the least restrictive environment meeting one another. So related services are typically part of an individualized education plan or a 504 plan. And guidance for this is provided in section 300.34 of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. So if you really want to dig into the law and see the exact wording about what related services are, I would guide you to read more there. But related service personnel help students achieve their goals. In some situations, related services actually are the special service that a student receives. So maybe they're not receiving services from an intervention specialist. Maybe they are receiving speech language pathology services as a standalone service, and they're not actually receiving any additional special education services. So related services include a lot of professionals. The ones I highlighted in purple, which are speech and language pathology, occupational therapy, and physical therapy, tend to be the most common ones that I've seen in schools. However, there are more. So related services includes all of these services. So speech language therapy, as I mentioned, audiology, interpreting services, psychological services, occupational therapy, physical therapy, therapeutic recreation, early identification and evaluation of children with disabilities, orientation and mobility, medical services for diagnostics or evaluation, but not beyond that, school health or school nurse services, social work, and even parent counseling is all considered related services. Now, each one of those disciplines has a very unique scope of practice. So it's important if you are a related service provider to know what your scope of practice is. And it's also important if you're part of the special education world to have a good sense of what each of those are. That would be literally a new presentation for each of those. So we won't dig into that during this presentation, but I'd advise you to look at the professional organizations for each of those. So for example, for occupational therapy, it would be the American Occupational Therapy Association. There is a video from the Ohio Department of Education that gives an overview of related service providers and who they are. I found this video to be beneficial, especially if you're in the state of Ohio, you may consider watching it. And we're going to try to skip over it here. So the least restrictive environment is also outlined in the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Section 300.114. Basically, the least restrictive environment says that we're going to provide educational services for students with disabilities as much as humanly possible, we're going to provide that education with their same age peers. So we have to take things into consideration. We have to look at the environment. We have to look at what supports we can put in place so that those kiddos can be educated with their same age peers. And this environment is decided on by that individualized education plan team. So it's not up to any one individual to decide what environment is most appropriate, but it should involve the entire team. The least restrictive environment, we're going to look starting at the bottom kind of this pyramid and working our way up to the least restrictive. So some kiddos are serviced in residential facilities. So they either reside at their school or they are educated in their own homes. Some kiddos go to separate schools. So looking at number 5. So these kiddos are students that attend schools that are specific for other children with disabilities. So they don't really have the opportunity to engage with their same age peers without disabilities. Number 4, a self-contained classroom. We see this oftentimes in our public education settings that there's self-contained classrooms. So it's students are taught by the intervention specialist or the special education teacher, and they're only with other special education students throughout the day. A resource room is used quite often where children are pulled out of their regular education classroom to meet with the resource teacher, which is the intervention specialist. And then we see inclusion where the special ed teacher and the general education teacher co-teach together. This is a really great model. There's lots of evidence-based practice that supports this model, both for the children receiving special education and those that are not. And then, of course, the general education class with no supports at all in place is not always feasible for everyone, but that is the goal, that these kiddos are served in the least restrictive environment with the minimal amount of supports that they would need. And again, the Ohio Department of Education has put together a video specific to the least restrictive environment. This particular video also gets into the state testing rubrics and deciding who is on alternative assessment. But you may want to watch this video, especially if you reside in Ohio. So as a related service provider, as an occupational therapy assistant, I have spent too much time, more than I care to admit, working out of closets and hallways and stairwells. And I really think it's time that we, as related service personnel and those that work in the special education world, we really need to start thinking beyond these small spaces and really apply the principles of least restrictive environment to the related services. So I have done a little research and come up with some ways that we can really adapt the least restrictive environment to fit the needs of related services, and how we can really collaborate with classroom teachers to provide services in the classroom. So collaboration, we need to be aware of the teacher's style, rules, and routines. This can be really tricky. Oftentimes, as related service personnel, we're in and out of lots of classrooms, working with different teachers. So we need to be really intentional about building relationships and building that collaboration. We also need to be flexible. Most related service personnel are really good at being flexible, but we just need to be mindful that we may need to shift at any given moment to meet the needs of the classroom. We can use groups to our advantage. Working in small groups, we are sometimes able to service in kind of a non-traditional way. We can include the same age peers in this group. So sometimes a teacher may say, hey, can you just get your eyes on this kiddo? They're not on your caseload. They're not receiving special ed services, but can you look at them, see what they're doing, offer a couple pointers? This is a great way to get that done. When we have groups, we can include those peers and everyone can kind of benefit from our skill sets. Having a schedule is really important. So working with teachers to schedule at appropriate times to be in the classroom. So if, for example, there's a classroom and they work in centers and they rotate between centers, it's a really great time to go into the room and just have the teacher welcome you to be a center in the classroom that the kiddos transition to. Transition time. So being mindful of when you're transitioning in and out of the classroom at appropriate times. So is the classroom quiet and the teacher is giving instruction, that wouldn't be the best time to open the door and come in. If the classroom is in utter chaos and you've left glitter everywhere, that's not a good time to leave. So being mindful of when you're coming and going. Therapy personnel are very good at grading and adapting activities. So by grading and adapting, I mean making them easier or harder and making modifications to the activity. So we can actually work with teachers to develop interventions. So maybe a teacher has an idea of an activity that they want to do in their classroom. We can figure out ways to make that activity accessible for all children. Oops. We need to know the goal of each of our students so that we can adjust activities as needed. And we also need to know our own scope of practice. So it's really important that, I'll use occupational therapy as the example here. It's really important that we don't get pigeonholed into being just the handwriting people or just the sensory people. But I need to be able to educate everyone on the full scope of occupational therapy practice so that I know what I bring to the table, and then the educators and the rest of the IEP team knows when it's appropriate to depend on me for information or insight. Pair up. So pair up treatment interventions with classroom content. So this is a really fun way to bring therapy to life in the classroom rather than kind of willy-nilly coming up with a topic. If I know what teachers are working on in their classroom, I can center my treatment interventions around that and really enhance what's happening in the classroom already. Communication, of course, is always important. So knowing the teacher's preferred method of communication and using it appropriately. Feedback. So oftentimes related service personnel are guilty of giving feedback. We also need to receive feedback. So teachers oftentimes know the kiddos much better than we do because they spend a lot more time with them. So not only providing feedback to the classroom, but asking for feedback in a respectful manner. Also thinking beyond the classroom. So there's lots of other spaces that we can utilize to address goals. So I love addressing goals in the cafeteria and at recess. And I've partnered up with an adaptive physical education teacher to meet therapy goals during those times. So get creative. And then following up. So it's really important that we do what we say we're going to do so we can be a trusted member of the IEP team. Here are some references for you from the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, as well as from an occupational therapy assistant textbook.